People often talk about history repeating itself, and no doubt there are many examples where this seems to be the case. One of the strangest I've heard of, and the one that affected me directly, relates to the stretch of train track that runs over the Clifton Arches in Moorton. More directly, it relates to the dozens of young men who over a period of almost 200 years have met their deaths by choosing to jump off them. If I'm honest, history was never my favorite subject at school, mostly because of the lazy and lackluster way in which it was taught and the corresponding lazy and lackluster way in which I studied for it. Our exam presentation project, for example, was simply to write a report on a local landmark, which to my mind was about as boring an assignment as it was possible to imagine. In the end, though, I found a way to try and make the whole thing a little more interesting by putting a more slightly sinister slant on it. I decided to focus my presentation on the arches, but instead of looking just at the architecture or the history of the thing's construction, I decided I would make my presentation a bit more macabre by investigating the many deaths linked to the arches. This stupidly adolescent attempt to shock backfired, however, as I would eventually go on to find out more than I ever wanted to know. The arches, as they are known locally, are actually the supporting props of the Clifton Victoria Viaduct, originally built in the early 1820s and officially opened in 1825. The viaduct itself is a solid blue brick structure stretching to a height of 150 feet in the air that runs between two stations on either side of Moorton, which stretches across the valley and over one of the main roads into Moorton. The effect being that anyone visiting or driving through the town is bound to see it. Not only that, but if they happen to be passing at one of 2 points during the hour, they will see the trains trundling across it, high above the tarmac. Over the decades, the height of the arches coupled with the hard landing below have led it to become a byword in Moorton for the act of taking one's life. Many is the time in around Moorton that you will hear someone throw up their hands in exasperation shouting, "Bloody hell, I might as well just go and jump off the arches." Or, "If that happened to me, I'd be straight up to Clifton Arches." Of course, this thoughtless turn of phrase implies more than simply going up to the arches and actually references the further step of deliberately jumping off them. Some might argue that the origin of this odd turn of phrase was not in fact suicide, but rather a tragedy that took place early in the life of the structure. According to reports from the time, in 1855, a passenger train stopped on the viaduct rather than at the station it was scheduled to stop at, and several passengers inadvertently stepped off into what was described as a particularly dark night, expecting to find the platform, though of course there was no platform, and they instead plummeted to their deaths. The structure's reputation, however, stretched far beyond this first tragedy. Whilst you'd have to ask someone like Archie Tanner, the town's local historian, to get the official number for how many people have met their deaths over the years by throwing themselves purposely off the viaduct, I can tell you without any research that it is definitely higher than you might think. In the time I have lived in the town, which is just over 20 years, I can think of at least 12 people, all young men, who have met their end in this way, which for a tiny town with a comparatively small population nestled in the hills is a very high rate indeed. Even years ago, at the time I was supposed to be doing my presentation, the number was high enough for me to think of doing my lip-curling insensitive project. As a basically disinterested and petulant teenager, I decided that in preparation for my presentation on local landmarks, I would investigate the lurid history of this landmark and dwell with all the tasteless, tactless selfishness that teenagers display on the more gruesome details in an attempt to purposely shock my classmates and frustrate my teachers. Having hatched this plan, I was explaining it proudly and admittedly somewhat loudly to a friend on the bus ride home when an old man I neither knew nor had ever met before approached the place where we were sitting and leaned in toward me. He was grinning broadly, and as he spoke, his rank breath seemed to claw at us. hitting us more forcefully even than his words.
If you're really going to do that, you should maybe ask yourself who or what made them normal, happy lives go up there in the first place. All of them over the years and years, all the same. I'm telling you, that's where you want to be digging, lad.
Then he got off at the next stop, leaving my friend and I to look at each other blankly and wonder what the hell he was on about. It was only around a fortnight later when I actually decided to get off my backside and do some research that I began to catch some hint of what the old man was getting at. Looking back through the old copies of the local newspaper at the local library, I read the reports of each of those suicides, separated by months and sometimes years, and noticed immediately the curious similarities between them. In every case, the boys were described as having been happy, popular boys with no history of mental illness or depression. It was mentioned in each report that the suicide was completely unexpected, but also in the weeks preceding the incident, the boys had complained of terrible nightmares in which a woman in Victorian dress kept pushing them from behind, urging them forwards, and in at least one case, up towards the arches. The idea that nobody had noticed this curious similarity between the accounts before initially got me excited, as if I stumbled across the equivalent of a big scoop for a journalist. I'll admit, though, it also perturbed me a little. Why had these young men, none of whom knew each other, had the exact same dreams? Who was the strange woman, and was the pushing involved in these dreams related in some way to their unexplained desires to go up to the arches and ultimately jump off? Sitting alone in the quiet and dark of the microfilm room, silently reading these details, I suddenly felt very alone and oddly vulnerable. I remember coughing loudly in an attempt to fill the room with sound and break the silence that seems to lay heavily across it. More than once I adjusted my position and looked around, just to check that the room was in fact as empty as I thought. As the microfilm sheets, thrown onto the screen by the room's only light source, clicked rhythmically past, like the sound of an approaching train, I'll admit that I felt an icy chill run down my spine. Again and again, I looked around hoping to ensure that I was in fact alone in that room, because whilst being alone was now suddenly uncomfortable, somehow the creeping possibility of not being alone was worse. As I swiped carefully through the mucky blots of faded newsprint, yellowed with age and faded in a way that made you imagine that one day they might diminish from view and disappear entirely, I thought over and over about the old man on the bus. Thought about his fetid breath, his grinning, wrinkled face, and the way he had smiled and winked at us conspiratorially, as if letting us in on some secret that neither of us had ever asked about or wanted to know. More than that, though, I thought about the woman in the Victorian dress, who, though the details in the paper never suggested any such thing, in my mind had become a gaunt, eyeless corpse. I saw her standing behind them, the pearl-white dome of her skull jutting out from beneath a tightly fitted bonnet, her cheeks sunken and collapsed, blackened teeth bared, and hair hanging in thick cobweb strands over the space where her nose once had been. In my private imaginings, she lunged forwards with outstretched, clasping hands and pushed these men to their deaths, screaming as she did with a laugh that was more dust and breath than real living sound. I decided then and there not to cover the arches as my topic, and that I wanted out of the microfilm room as quickly as possible. When the time came for me to present, I instead covered the cenotaph in the town square, relating the local history in a dry, boring but perfectly acceptable presentation that in the end garnered me a fair mark. I never found out who the old man was, and never mentioned the link I thought I'd discovered to anyone. It was only years later, when I heard that the trains out of Moorton had been cancelled for the day because of a local man intent on throwing himself off the arches, had needed to be talked down by police, that I again thought about this strange story and the project that never was. The memory came back more starkly later that day when I discovered the identity of the would-be jumper. It was a guy named Lenny Donlan. a lad I had gone to school with, but to whom I hadn't spoken properly in years. A lad who had also happened to be sitting next to me on the bus the day the old man spoke to us. Having been half convinced by the police not to jump, then wrestled to the ground by two of the officers and dragged away before he could hurt himself, Lenny had been taken away and sectioned under the Mental Health Act. According to what I was told by his sister, when he was taken away, he was screaming about a woman with no eyes in an old worldly dress who had forced him up there. Pushing, he said, at my back. With them horrible hands, she was pushing. Just always pushing.